all bodies are good bodies and all bodies deserve respect, because our bodies change, and if your self-worth, your contentment with yourself is dependent on looking a certain way, then that's very fragile ground.
So if we're looking at true prevention, what we're really looking at is shifting those societal ideas. And that starts with our children, right? Like, I think we can look at societal challenges and kind of be overwhelmed by them and think, oh, we can't change the whole of society. How do we do that? That seems so, abstract. What are some of the myths that you've encountered in social media when it comes to body image or body satisfaction?
I think one, a favourite of diet culture and fitness culture is that
From Biggest Loser trainer to counselling psychologist with a doctorate from Regent's University, Dr. Charlotte Ord has over a decade of experience in health fitness, pain management, and eating disorders. A leading voice on body image, self-esteem, and body satisfaction, her work is being featured by the BBC, Sky News, and The Guardian. Charlotte is also the author of Body Confident You, Body Confident Kid, a practical 7-step plan to help parents protect children from harmful diet culture and build lasting body confidence. Stay tuned, you won't want to miss this conversation. I know you have had such an interesting journey to get to where you are today, from gym owner to biggest loser trainer to working as a psychologist specializing in eating disorders and body image. So can you tell me a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, of course. So I started, as you said, as a personal trainer, and at that point was very focused on weight loss, fat loss, white knuckling through, ignoring needs, and in pursuit of this kind of thin ideal that I think most
Mhm.
people were very focused on, particularly in the fitness industry back then. And that sort of got me the role on The Biggest Loser. Although even at that point, I had started to question how truly healthy that pursuit was, even though that's what everyone was really looking for at the time. And I then became very interested in the concept of health at every size, that
Mhm.
paradigm. And that's once I really started to understand that concept and recognize that this sort of dogged determination to lose weight and to be a certain body size was not only ruining my own health, but also some of my clients, or certainly was very unsustainable for most people. It felt like I couldn't go back. And so I totally changed my business model as a gym owner at that point, stopped promoting fat loss and weight loss completely, and really started to focus more on intuitive eating, on really listening to my own body, my clients' bodies, and it felt so much better because it felt like this was something that people could actually sustain and that
Mhm.
genuinely supported health as opposed to ignoring it in pursuit of what looked like health. And from there, I became more and more interested in the kind of psychology of eating and exercise and weight. And that led me to pursue my doctorate in psychology. I'd already always been interested in psychology, having done my undergrad degree in that. And it seemed like the right time to then pursue that. And so that's what I did. And so I did my training. I did several placements in quite sort of body focused services, both in terms of eating disorders. And I worked in a bariatric service, which is a weight loss surgery.
Mhm.
And I also worked for the Ministry of Defence Rehabilitation Centre, with working with injured servicemen and women who had experienced, life-changing injuries to their bodies, and then went into private practice after that. So it's been quite a journey and quite a turnaround in many ways, but a kind of natural transition and evolution.
Yeah, it makes sense, but it is such a different world, isn't it, coming from a training environment? But I think even before that, it sounds like you had a real internal shift in the way that you were viewing the work that you were doing pre-psychology. So, as a gym owner and as a personal trainer, that you've gone through that shift already. But I am wondering, because I know when you go into the world of psychology, obviously you learn so much and you have a lot of personal reflections on maybe the ways that you viewed things previously, or ideas that you held, or beliefs that you held before becoming a psychologist, and the interesting things that you learn along the way. What's a key lesson that you've learned, or something that's shifted for you over that journey?
I think it's that confidence doesn't come from looking a certain way or being a certain body size. It comes from real, genuine self acceptance and acceptance of yourself, flaws and all, and recognizing that you're deserving of love and respect, both from other people and yourself, regardless of your shortcomings or what you look like. That for me was a really big realization.
Mm.
And that's something I really try to convey to my clients, both historically in the fitness industry, but also now as a psychologist. Because our bodies change, and if your self-worth and your contentment with yourself is dependent on looking a certain way, then that's very fragile ground, because bodies change as they age. That's natural, that's normal. But we're sort of taught that it's not, and realizing that.
Absolutely. There's, I'm sure we're going to talk a bit about that, some of that
Mm.
messaging that's out there in society. But I love that shift from really the external to the internal, and how you're feeling in terms of your own body, and more than that, your own self esteem and your own well being, rather than that external focus that we can really, I think, get pressured by society around those ideals. How common is body dissatisfaction?
It's really common. There was a study or survey a few years ago that showed that 80% of people have body dissatisfaction, and to such an extent that it impacts their mental health. And I think 60% of respondents in that survey also said that it impacted their physical health. Now, that's more
Wow.
true for girls and women than it is for boys and men, but nevertheless, even for boys and men, it was around 30%. Said that it, had a big impact on them. They worried about it on a daily basis. So it's something that I think affects a huge amount of people and has become so normalized. I think, we've got to a place where we bond over body bashing, and,
Mm.
that it's a way to sort of feel involved and belong, which is so sad that that's the way that we connect, is over dissing ourselves essentially.
Absolutely. That's self-deprecation, isn't it? And even if it's done in that, I mean, I know in Australia we're very sarcastic, that very
Right.
sarcastic kind of humor, but the damage it does when you're internally kind of giving yourself that messaging, and externally socially talking in that way. And it's interesting, I think, that, 30% is quite high for males. And I think that would shock a lot of people to know that, men really do struggle with body dissatisfaction as well. What have you found in the work that you've been doing in terms of, the experiences that men have?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's slightly different for boys and men because the body ideals are slightly different. But the boys that I work with, the young men that I work with, are very focused on things like being lean, being muscular. There's a big trend in supplementation, like protein supplementation, going
Mhm.
to the gym, this kind of gym culture. And of course, having a very lean, low body fat, muscular physique just isn't natural or normal for a lot of boys. That's, genetically, that's, something that not everyone has a propensity for. And so it leaves them very vulnerable to influences like steroid use, dieting excessively, using very, very high protein diets, which are not necessarily healthy. And it's a slightly different presentation to girls and women, but nevertheless, it's something that they really, really find really challenging.
Mm. I think it's so fascinating, your skill set from a therapy perspective, for that person sitting in front of you, because I know I've done a little bit of work in eating disorders historically,
Mm.
and your skill set is limited to a degree in your knowledge, if that makes sense. So particularly around nutrition, etc. Like, you have to learn a lot to work in that space. You have to really upskill. But you've come from the reverse end, so you bring so much knowledge into that space, and I imagine that for a person, particularly I think even for a male, I would say even more so that that's really important to know that you get it, like that you get the importance of the gym workout, what that means to them, the language that they're using, like you're so familiar with that language and
Mm.
with their goals around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I very much come from being in the trenches, both in terms
Yeah,
of
yeah.
coming from, fitness culture, but also having been so heavily impacted by that myself as well. Like I know what that feels like. And not that I'd assume that my experience is the same as anyone else's, of course, but I think it helps to have some understanding of the struggle and the challenges that present. And also, I work with a lot of athletes and a lot of people who take their physical training, their sport, whether as a professional or an amateur, very seriously.
Mhm.
And that also creates a tension because there's, the performance aspect, they want to compete well, and then there's the appearance aspect. And sometimes being lean, being thin, looking a certain way does play a part in that performance. So for endurance sports, for example, or gymnastics and so on. And so there's all these kind of tensions to juggle and to navigate, and finding the right way through that for each individual is individual. And
Mm.
it has to be acknowledged. You can't just say, "Oh, well, it doesn't matter," because actually it does matter. To some people, it does really matter. And a bit like with food, exercise is something that, you know, can and should form a part of a healthy, balanced way of living to some extent. And again, finding the right balance for each person takes time, exploration, compassion, and some courage too to lean into, how it's really serving you and what it's really
Mm.
being used for.
What are 3 things that we can do to increase our body positivity? Recognizing that, as you've just said, there is an individualized element there.
Yeah, I think so. First of all, broadening your perspective of what beauty is, and recognizing that beauty comes in all different shapes, sizes. Um, Being aware of the language that you use, both about your own body and other people's bodies, because that, as mentioned earlier, that really reinforces the beliefs and the feelings that we have around bodies. And if we're constantly talking negatively about how we look, it reinforces that feeling, that narrative, and it just breeds more of the same. And of course, if you've got children or young people around you, then you are setting them up also to take on certain beliefs about bodies, remembering that they may one day have the same body as you, or a very similar body to you.
Mm.
Um, I think actively rejecting diet culture is a really empowering way to approach this too. So being mindful about the conversations that you take part in, and leaving or setting boundaries around those conversations so that you're not being exposed to diet talk or fat phobic talk or stigmatizing conversations. And the same in the online spaces. So removing yourself, doing a thorough audit of your feed so that you're not being exposed constantly to messaging that reinforces this ideal that only some bodies are acceptable or worthy or valuable. And
Mhm.
and then actively following people who promote the opposite, the fact that, all bodies are good bodies and all bodies deserve respect, and that you can be healthy at every size, and that health comes in all shapes and sizes too. Those
Mm.
are
And
a few.
there's such a fine line there, isn't there, between where we're in that space where we're struggling with body image, which, as you said, is it's very normal, and 80% of women and 30% of men may be struggling with that. So that's a very common experience to have, and particularly at different stages of our lives, because I know you work in those two spaces. So you have a lot in your social media feed around, body dissatisfaction and body positivity. But I know that you also work with people recovering from eating disorders. Can you explain the difference between the two?
Sure. So body dissatisfaction is something that it's a big risk factor for eating disorders, but not everyone who has body dissatisfaction will develop disordered eating. And likewise, not everyone that has an eating disorder is dissatisfied by their body. It's one of the strongest risk factors, So it's often part of that presentation. But eating disorders, can be caused by trauma, by social circumstances, by coping skills, but there's all sorts of different for trauma, all sorts of different factors that can contribute to that. So they are strongly linked, but not dependent on one another. And body dissatisfaction, as you say, can ebb and flow. It can be something that you feel one day and not the next. Um, and it can also be something that doesn't necessarily impact someone's behavior. But
Mhm.
often what happens is when people do feel very dissatisfied with their body, they will use disordered eating or exercise or those types of behaviors to try and fix that feeling, to try and shift that feeling. And that's how it starts to contribute to a disordered eating presentation.
Yeah, it's so important, I think, to understand those early warning signs for disordered eating and what moves into that space. I'm also really interested before you mentioned, when you were talking about those three things that we can do for body positivity, you talked about the language that we're using for in our friendship groups, but also the language that we might be using as parents in front of our
Mm.
children. And I know you have a book coming out, which
Love to
I'm
hear
really
it.
excited to read as a parent,
I'm sure we.
because this is one of those spaces that I know a lot of parents struggle with, and I know I'm going to find challenging as my children. I mean, obviously, it's important from a very early age. We know the language
Mm,
that we use around our children, but particularly as they get older, I think that for me personally, I know that the societal messages will become stronger and will be a bit more of a challenging space. So I want to use your expertise because I know parents listening are, wanting their children to have such a healthy relationship with their body, with food, with exercise. But the reality is that we're just not taught this stuff. We're not taught the language to use. We're not taught how to talk to our kids about these topics. And we've grown up in a society with so much unhealthy messaging. And I know myself that I catch myself, oh gosh, frequently saying things that I'm like, hold on a minute.
mm,
Just catch yourself there, little ears are around. But also, for myself, like
mm.
the things that I'm saying and the language that I'm using. So I wanted to ask you, what do you say if your kid comes to you and says, I'm fat?
Yeah, I get asked this question so often, and I think as you say, it's parents aren't taught how to handle that. And I think the natural inclination for lots of parents is to say, "Oh no, you're not. You're beautiful," which is so natural, especially because most of us have grown up in this culture of fat being the worst thing you could possibly be, which of course is ridiculous. But that's the messaging we've been given, and so of course we want to try and neutralize that distress in children. But of course, when we do that, we shut down the conversation. We dismiss their distress around it. And um, and it actually perpetuates this idea that being fat is too bad to even be spoken about. And that it's it's the worst that you could be, or that we can't even talk about it. So actually, if a kid comes to you and says, "I'm fat," I try and be really curious about what they mean by that, because there's also assumption, I think, for us as adults to assume that that word is being used in a negative way when actually it's being reclaimed in many circles as a neutral descriptor, which is what it should be, just like tall or brunette or blonde or whatever. And to ask your kids, what are you feeling? What does that mean to you? What's made you feel that way? And to remind them, use it as an opportunity to remind them that all bodies are good bodies. All bodies come in different shapes and sizes. And the most important thing is how we treat ourselves and each other. And so that way you're reinforcing the message that body diversity is normal, that size isn't a moral value, and that it's okay to talk about these things. And the same goes, for if someone else has called your kid fat and they're upset about that, to help them be curious about what that other person meant, whether what they might have been feeling, And so you're really recognizing that, or helping your child to recognize that the problem is not their body. The problem is people name calling or using mean words or insulting words. And so you really highlight what the actual problem is, which is not their body. And you kind of help them to keep their their self-value and their self-worth intact. Um, Otherwise, if we reinforce this idea for kids that being bigger is a problem, you you know you leave with them this fear of weight gain, which it
Mm.
doesn't actually matter what body size they are. Once that's developed, it stays with you, as most of us have experienced this kind of struggle.
That's such great advice, and it's so simple really. It's catching ourselves in that moment as
Mm,
parents, and, when the heartstrings are pulled and we wanna react and we wanna stop the pain or our
yeah,
perceived idea of pain or anxiety. So it's just catching ourselves in that moment and really
yeah.
leaning in with curiosity and
Yeah, in your case,
understanding.
it's so important to be compassionate with yourself around that, because when
Mhm.
you've spent many, many years in diet culture being told that being bigger is a problem and that you should diet and change your weight to be acceptable, of course you're going to feel that way. Of course you are. And of course you're going to want to protect your child from that. But it's recognizing that actually, by trying to protect them, we're actually perpetuating this narrative that it's not okay to be bigger. And, that's just simply not true. And I know there's still so much health advice that perpetuates this idea that, that if you're of a higher weight, then you are, more sort of at risk of certain health issues. But actually, there are no health conditions that fat people experience that thinner body people don't. And there is also no research that doesn't control for the impact of weight stigma and weight cycling. That is sort of what, yo-yo dieting,
Mhm.
effectively, the impact of weight. And and those things have independently been proven to have a negative impact on health. And so, is it actually weight that causes these health issues, or is it the stress that being in a stigmatized and discriminated upon body that causes those health implications and the effects of dieting over and over and over again?
It's so interesting because, I absolutely understand what you're saying. What you're saying is that negative impact that we may see with someone who is maybe at a higher BMI, for example, may not be about the higher BMI at all. It's about the societal impact of what being a higher BMI means. And the negative outcomes of that is actually causing stress in our body. It's causing illness in our body because we know that link between stress and health is there, and all those other things that start to get
Mm,
impacted, like our mood and anxiety, etc. That
exactly.
makes so much sense that there's a link there between those things.
Yeah, and of course, when you are the subject of discrimination and weight stigma, which is still so prevalent, then you are much more likely to engage in coping strategy to try and relieve that, like binge eating,
Mhm.
like using food to soothe, self-soothe.
Mhm.
And so it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. Um, and that's not to do with weight, that's to do with exposure to, you know, things that harm your mental health effectively.
It's fascinating. I find it so fascinating when you can peel back research and start to see the societal impact of what's happening with someone, and that it's not directly what's genetically or biologically happening in someone's body. It's what's external in the environment and the role that that's playing in the biology that they're experiencing.
Yeah. And I saw this firsthand when I was working in bariatrics, that I assessed hundreds and hundreds of people across various services. And what really struck me was that, yes, these are people of, notably higher weight, and yet a significant percentage of them didn't actually have any health issues whatsoever. The reason that they were undergoing this life-changing and really quite risky surgery was for two reasons. One, because of their fear of developing a health issue because that is what they've been told, that their body was a ticking time bomb. I mean, how stressful is that to be told that your body is a threat to yourself? And also because they just wanted to be treated like a normal person.
That's heartbreaking.
To have half your stomach amputated so that people treat you normally and that you're given the same opportunities as other people, including in healthcare. Because there's so much weight bias and stigma in healthcare. I had a friend say to me, I actually included this in my book, that she was always a high weight person, and she said that she could go to the doctor with a 9-inch nail through her palm and they would still blame it on her weight. And so bigger body people don't tend to get the same treatment or treatment options as thinner body people. And when you go to the doctor over and over, and every time everything you say is blamed on your weight, eventually you stop going. And of course,
Yes, I was going to say that. Yeah.
that also has an impact on, on your health outcomes, because if you're not getting the same health treatment and support, then the likelihood is your health is going to suffer in some way. So it's a very kind of complex picture. But I think we have to be so critical about these beliefs that we've sort of inherited about what it means to weigh a certain amount and what, if any, link that has with your health.
This conversation was so interesting, and there was simply too much to unpack in one episode. So we kept the conversation going. Look out for part 2 coming next week. Subscribe for more conversations filled with new insights, inspiration, and practical tools to create a life you love.